Aidan stood on the hillside, the reins of Hermann's horse clutched tightly in his hand. Before him, the city of Blue Watervale stretched out in an endless sprawl of stone and sea. Its castle loomed high on a hill, towers and battlements casting long shadows over the city below. The ocean's waves crashed rhythmically against the cliffs, and the ports were alive with ships of every size, their sails billowing in the cool breeze. Banners from every corner of the realm flew from their masts, greens, reds, and blues fluttering in the wind like vibrant patches on a dull grey sky. Behind him, the forest whispered, still dark and sombre in the early morning light. Aidan's arms ached from the night before, hours spent digging Hermann's grave beneath the stars. He had laid the old knight to rest in the cold earth, saying a silent prayer to the goddess as the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky. He'd marked the grave with a crude pile of rocks, all he could find in the dense forest, before turning away and leaving the man who had been his only family behind. Now, here he stood, with Hermann's sword, his rusty, dented armor, and a meager pouch of coins, looking out at the city that might decide his fate. Blue Watervale, the city by the sea. His heart swelled with awe and fear. It was vast, far larger than any place he'd ever seen. He could see people moving like ants in the streets, merchants and craftsmen, knights and beggars, travelers, from every kingdom filling the city's veins. The life and movement of it all sent a shiver down his spine. Somewhere in that mass of people, his future awaited. The horse beside him whinnied softly, pulling him from his thoughts. He patted its neck absent-mindedly, and started down the hillside, his eyes never leaving the city. There was no turning back now. Aidan wandered through the busy streets, his eyes wide with amazement. Colorful flags fluttered from every building, and the scents of roasting meat, spiced wine, and the sea mixed together in the air. People from all over the realm filled the streets, knights in shining armor, merchants hawking wares, craftsmen shaping iron and stone, and beautiful women in flowing gowns of every hue. Their laughter and chatter filled his ears, a cacophony of life he had never experienced. He stopped at a stall selling baked bread and bought a loaf, tearing into it hungrily. He hadn't eaten since the day before, and his stomach gnawed at him in protest. After finishing his meal, he made his way to an inn, paying for a small room with some of the gold Hermann had left him. It was a modest place, with creaking floorboards and thin walls, but it was a roof over his head. He left his horse in the stables, handing the stable boy a few coins for his trouble, then set out again, his goal clear in his mind. He needed to enlist in the tournament. If he had any hope of making something of himself, it was here, in the Grand Colosseum, where knights from across the realm would fight for glory, honor, and riches. If he could just win a few matches, he might catch the eye of a noble, someone who would take him in, offer him a place in their household. Aidan's steps quickened as he approached the Colosseum. It was a massive structure, towering above the city like a monument to power and blood. Its stone walls gleamed in the sunlight, and already the crowds were gathering, excitement buzzing in the air. He joined the long line of knights waiting to register for the tournament. The men around him were all seasoned warriors, their armor polished to a shine, their crests displayed proudly on their shields. Aidan felt out of place, a boy in old, dented armor, with no title, no name, and no real experience. His heart hammered in his chest as he waited, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. When he finally reached the front of the line, the clerk behind the desk barely glanced up at him. "Your master's name?" the man asked, scribbling on a parchment without looking. Aidan hesitated. I'm fighting." The clerk stopped writing and looked up, his brows furrowing in confusion. "You?" He glanced at Aidan's worn armor and the plain sword at his side. "What's your title, then? Your crest?" Aidan flushed, embarrassment heating his face. He had no title, no crest. He was just Aidan, a boy who had grown up on the streets, with nothing to his name but the sword of a dead man and a dream that felt more foolish by the second. I was knighted by Sir Hermann," Aidan stammered. "Hermann?" The clerk squinted at him, clearly unimpressed. "Never heard of him." Aidan could feel the eyes of the other knights in line behind him, their impatience growing. He needed to say something, anything. He glanced around desperately, his eyes catching sight of the waves crashing against the cliffs far below the castle. The name came to him in a flash. "Sir Aidan Stormbreaker," he blurted out, the words tumbling from his lips before he could think. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Stormbreaker?" His voice was heavy with skepticism. "You expect me to believe you're a knight of House Storm?" "No," Aidan said quickly, panic rising in his chest. "It's just a name?" The clerk looked him over, clearly unconvinced, but with a sigh, he scribbled something on the parchment. "Fine. You've got the gold to pay the entry fee." Aidan nodded, handing over the last of the gold Hermann had left him. The clerk took it, his expression bored, and waved him along. "Next." Aidan exhaled a shaky breath and stepped away from the line, relief and fear mingling in his chest. He had done it. He was officially entered in the tournament. But as he walked through the crowded streets, the weight of what he had just committed to pressed down on him. If he lost, he would forfeit everything, his gold, his horse, even Hermann's armor. He had nothing left. No home to return to, no family to turn to. His stomach twisted with anxiety, and the noise and bustle of the city suddenly became overwhelming. The clamor of voices, the clanging of blacksmiths' hammers, the laughter and shouts of merchants, it all pressed in on him, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. He needed to get away, to find somewhere quiet, somewhere he could gather his thoughts. Without thinking, Aidan ducked into a random building, pushing open the heavy wooden door and stepping inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the noise from the street faded, replaced by a soft, serene silence. He found himself in a library. Rows of shelves filled with books and scrolls lined the walls, their leather-bound spines catching the light that filtered through the high windows. People sat at tables, reading or writing in quiet contemplation, their faces calm and focused. The scent of parchment and ink filled the air, and the atmosphere was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Aidan let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in his body ease. He wandered further into the library, his eyes scanning the shelves, though he couldn't read most of the titles. He had never learned more than the basics of reading, but the sight of so much knowledge, so much history, all gathered in one place, made him feel small and insignificant. As he walked, his gaze was drawn to an upstairs window. There, sitting by the open window with a book in her hand, was a young woman. She had long, black hair that cascaded down her back, and she wore a light blue dress that shimmered in the sunlight streaming in from the window. Her face was serene, her eyes focused on the pages of the book, completely absorbed in her reading. For a moment, Aidan forgot to breathe. The light from the window reflected off the ocean outside, casting a soft glow around her figure, making her look almost ethereal. There was something about her, something graceful, peaceful, that took his breath away. He stood there, frozen, watching her as if in a trance. The world outside, the tournament, the city, the noise and chaos, faded into the background. All he could see was her, sitting there in the quiet, the soft rustle of pages the only sound that reached his ears. Aidan felt a strange pull in his chest, something he couldn't quite explain. He had never seen anyone like her before. In the streets of Blue Water Vale, with its bustling crowds and loud merchants, she was a calm, still presence, like the eye of a storm. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching her, until finally, he tore his gaze away. He didn't belong here, in this place of calm and quiet. He was a street rat, a boy pretending to be a knight. But as he left the library and stepped back into the chaos of the city, the image of the girl in the window stayed with him, her calm presence lingering in the back of his mind like a soft, distant echo.